This move immediately stakes a claim in the center, opening lines for the queen and king's bishop, and sets the stage for a wide variety of popular openings. The Sicilian defense immediately creates an unbalanced pawn structure, challenging white's central pawn and preparing for counterplay on the queenside. This move develops a knight towards the center, supporting the e4 pawn and preparing to castle, while also maintaining flexibility for white's subsequent development in the Sicilian defense. This move initiates the classical variation of the Sicilian defense, immediately challenging white's central pawn and preparing to develop pieces to active squares, while creating an unbalanced pawn structure. This move initiates the main line of the open Sicilian, immediately challenging black's pawn structure and opening lines for white's pieces. This move opens the center, establishing a classical pawn structure for the Sicilian defense and initiating a strategic battle for central control that will define the game's character. This move develops a knight to an active central square, immediately challenging black's control of the d5 square and preparing for further central pawn expansion. This move, 4 nf6, is a developing move that challenges white's central pawn and prepares for kingside castling, typical of many lines within the Sicilian defense aiming to equalize quickly. This move, nc3, continues white's development and supports the central d4 pawn, aiming for a classical Sicilian setup where white typically enjoys a slight space advantage and initiative. This move initiates the dragon variation of the Sicilian defense, preparing to fianchetto the king's bishop to control the long diagonal and exert pressure on white's center. This move develops the bishop to a stable square, preparing to castle and connect the rooks while supporting the central pawn push. This move develops the bishop to a strong diagonal, preparing to castle and controlling important central squares while also reinforcing the pawn on d6. Castling kingside completes white's initial development and secures the king, allowing the rooks to connect and prepare for activity on the central files that are likely to open soon in this Sicilian dragon variation. This move continues the natural development of black's pieces, preparing to contest the center and potentially challenge white's central pawn majority. This move strategically repositions the knight to a more flexible square, aiming to support a potential queenside expansion while maintaining central influence and avoiding the pin that would occur if it remained on c3 after black's e5. Black correctly castles to safety, consolidating their king's position within the pawn structure while preparing to connect the rooks and potentially challenge white's central control. This move develops the bishop actively, targeting black's knight and preparing to potentially disrupt black's queenside pawn structure if the knight is forced to move. This move prepares to challenge white's central pawn majority and potentially open lines for black's pieces, aiming to disrupt white's harmonious development and prepare for counterplay on the queenside. This move, King's Indian attack setup against the Sicilian, strategically repositions the king away from the queenside and potentially prepares for a kingside pawn storm or avoids potential checks and tactical skirmishes on the g-file. This move initiates a queenside expansion, aiming to challenge white's control of the queenside and potentially create weaknesses or open lines for black's pieces. This move shores up the queenside pawn structure and prevents black from expanding on that flank with moves like b5, while also opening the a-file for potential endgame play. This move prepares to reinforce the central pawn structure and potentially reroute the knight to a more active square, typically c5 or e5, supporting the fight for central control. This move aggressively expands white's pawn center and prepares to open lines for attacking play. aiming to exploit black's slightly underdeveloped kingside. This move prepares to reinforce the kingside by potentially transferring the knight to the kingside, or to challenge white's d4 pawn should white play e5. This aggressive pawn thrust seizes space on the kingside, aiming to break open lines towards black's castled king and exploit the potentially vulnerable g7 bishop. This move challenges white's bishop, aiming to disrupt white's piece coordination and potentially gain control of the c4 g8 diagonal. This move exchanges the fianchettoed bishop for white's knight, which, while opening the a file for black's rook, also relinquishes the strong diagonal for black's bishop that was pressuring white's queenside. This move exchanges a knight for a bishop, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially activate black's rook on the c-file later. This move centralizes the queen, reinforcing the f3 knight and preparing to potentially support a further kingside pawn advance or connect the rooks. This move redirects the knight from the active c4 square to b6, preparing to challenge white's central control and potentially exploit the queenside pawn structure. This move aims to exploit the awkward placement of black's knight on b6, creating threats against the d7 pawn and potentially opening lines for white's pieces while disrupting black's coordination. This move directly challenges white's queen, forcing it to move and creating a strong central outpost for black's knight on d4. This move initiates a crucial pawn structure change, simplifying the position and leading to a more open game where knight activity and control of central squares become paramount. This exchange of pieces clarifies the pawn structure and opens the d-file for white's rook, while black secures a strong outpost for the knight on d4. This move activates the rook to the open d-file, supporting the knight on d4 and preparing to challenge black's control of this central column. The move ***18 bg7*** is a recapture, returning the bishop to a key diagonal after ***17 bxd4, allowing black to maintain the pawn on d6 and contest the central dark squares. This move develops the bishop to an active diagonal and prepares to support a central pawn advance, or reinforce the queenside defense. This move re-centers the knight, preparing to reinforce the d6 pawn and potentially explore the c5 square or even a central outpost, if the opportunity arises. This knight move is a strong positional play, aiming to exploit the weak d6 pawn and potentially create a strong outpost on d5 for the knight, restricting black's pieces. This move prepares to reinforce the e-file and potentially support a later e5 advance, a common theme in this Sicilian structure to challenge white's central control. This move solidifies the d4 pawn and prepares for a potential kingside pawn advance or reinforcement of the central control, while also offering a stable pawn chain against black's knight on d7. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal and prepares for potential central pawn breaks like d5, while also supporting the knight on d7. This move, b-flat6, directly attacks the c7 pawn, which is currently undefended and is a critical weakness in black's position, aiming to exploit the lack of immediate defenders. This capture is a strategic decision to eliminate white's active knight, disrupting their central control and opening lines for black's pieces while preparing to exploit the weakened queenside pawn structure. This knight sacrifice aims to break open the queenside and potentially create a passed pawn while disrupting white's pawn structure. The rook on a6 aims to contest the a-file and potentially threaten black's queenside pawns, while also preparing to support a future advance of the b-pawn. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, eyeing potential forks and ready to support a queenside advance. The queen repositions to b8 to prepare for potential a5-a4 advances and to contest the b file if it opens, also creating a safe square on c7 for the knight later. This move initiates an exchange that simplifies the position and creates an open a file for white, potentially allowing for increased pressure on black's queenside. This move brings the rook to the semi-open c file, contesting white's control and preparing to challenge the advanced white knights. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to pressure black's queenside and potentially support a d4-d5 pawn advance in the future, while also preparing to challenge the isolated pawn on a5. This move aims to disrupt white's coordination by sacrificing a piece for a pawn and attempting to open lines against the white king, though the material imbalance remains a significant concern. The knight's return to b6 aims to control the important c4 square and prepare for potential exchanges, though it retreats from more active central territory. This capture aims to break white's queenside pressure and potentially free black's position, but it surrenders a pawn for initiative and requires careful defensive coordination. The capture of the rook on b6 is a decisive material advantage, simplifying the position and opening the d-file for potential king attacks. The recapture of the knight with the bishop aims to simplify the position after white's queen has forced the exchange of queens, and the knight on c4 now has no support. This move aims to create a passed pawn on the queenside and restrict black's pieces, but it also weakens white's own queenside pawn structure. This move is a strategic regrouping, bringing the rook to a more active position to defend the advanced pawn and potentially control the c file, while also preparing for future pawn advances on the queenside. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, aiming to attack the vulnerable d6 pawn and potentially support a pawn advance on the queenside. This move defends the pawn on c7 and aims to consolidate the queenside while preparing to potentially exchange pieces to simplify the position. This move centralizes the rook, preparing to exchange it on the c file and create a passed pawn with the queenside majority while simultaneously pressuring black's weakened c-pawn. This move seems to be a passive retreat, potentially allowing white to consolidate their queenside advantage and further restrict black's pieces on the exposed a-file. The move 32, qd3 aims to consolidate white's material advantage, improve queen activity, and prepare to attack black's exposed king on the queenside. The king moves to a safer square, anticipating potential threats along the c-file and preparing for potential kingside pawn advances. This rook move prepares to contest the open c-file, aiming to prevent black from consolidating their position and potentially supporting an advance of the pawn on a5. This move initiates a pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to create weaknesses and open lines for attack against white's king. A common strategic idea in this type of King's Indian defense setup. This move prepares to centralize the queen to a more active square, supporting potential pawn advances and eyeing weaknesses in black's king position. This move seems passive, failing to challenge white's dominant central pawn structure and allowing white to maintain positional pressure on the queenside. This pawn push aims to create a strong defensive wall on the kingside, limiting the mobility of black's pieces and potentially preparing a later advance to gain space. The black queen repositions to c8, aiming to support the g5 pawn push and potentially challenge the white queen's influence on the queenside, while also preparing for future defensive or counter-attacking maneuvers. The king now repositions to the more secure g2 square, creating a defensive pawn chain and preparing to potentially support a pawn advance later in the game. This move repositions the queen to a more active central square, potentially preparing to support pawn advances on the kingside or to exert pressure along the open d-file, aiming to improve its coordination with the remaining pieces. This move aims to solidify white's central control and prepare for further pawn advances, potentially targeting black's kingside weaknesses. This move begins a defensive maneuver to reposition the queen and potentially support a g5 g4 pawn push, aiming to fortify the king's position against white's queenside pressure. This move aims to prevent black's intended g4 and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside later if white can consolidate. The queen repositions to d8, unblocking the rook on d7 and preparing to support an eventual g5 g4 pawn push, aiming to create further attacking chances on the kingside. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, aiming to control the critical d-file and potentially support a kingside pawn advance while keeping an eye on black's underdeveloped queenside. This move prepares to defend the kingside by creating a pawn chain with g5 and f6, solidifying the position against potential kingside attacks and freeing the g7 bishop. This move is preparing to defend the king by creating an escape square on h2, a common defensive maneuver in situations where the king is potentially exposed on the kingside. This move develops the bishop to a more active square where it can potentially attack the kingside, and also defends the g5 pawn. This move re-establishes pressure on the queenside and prepares to contest the open c-file should black exchange pawns, while also potentially aiming to exploit any weaknesses in black's pawn structure. The move 41, qh8, repositions the queen to a more active square, supporting the central pawn push and potentially preparing to contest the open h-file if white plays kh2. This move attacks the weak bishop on h3, forcing white to either defend it or lose material, while also preparing to potentially advance the g-pawn further to disrupt white's king's shelter. This move initiates a critical pawn break on the kingside, aiming to open lines and create attacking chances against white's king, which has become somewhat exposed after white's pawn advances. This move captures a pawn that was undefended and dangerously advanced, but it weakens the kingside pawn structure, potentially creating long-term defensive vulnerabilities. After a prolonged exchange of material and strategic maneuvering, this move voluntarily removes the queen from the board, signaling a likely transition into an endgame where white's passed pawns on the queenside will become a significant threat. This move decisively wins a pawn in the endgame, simplifying the position and leveraging white's material advantage. With the material imbalances resulting from the recent exchanges, black seeks to activate their remaining bishop, aiming to create counterplay by targeting white's kingside pawns. This move aims to expand white's queenside pawn majority, aiming to create a passed pawn or open lines for potential endgame advantages.